Okay, so today for this demo, we will go through the circular flow of income model and discuss the differences between a closed economy and an open economy. And then by the end of this, we should probably have a better understanding of what goes into an economy, what goes out, and what can be injected and leaked out of the economy as well. So hopefully you guys can see the textbook on the screen. So starting at 8.1 economic activity. So in terms of macroeconomics, there's a model that a lot of economists use, and it's called the circular flow of income model. Circular flow of income model. And basically what it does is it shows what goes into an economy in terms of resource markets and product markets, and also what comes out of an economy and what can be injected within an economy. So as you guys can see in the model, there are kind of four big blocks. There's the resource market, the product market, and households and firms. So each arrow demonstrates how resources and products flow from one to the other. So as you can see from resource markets, which basically are like the resource markets are where household income and also like land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, the three resources that individuals can obtain within an economy. So that comes from the resource market. The product markets are, in terms of businesses and goods and services, what they are able to produce and provide to consumers and customers within an economy as well. So that's resource and product markets. In terms of the kind of individuals that go into providing these transactions, there's two categories of them. First, there are households, and households they don't have the same traditional like definition as you might think. Households in terms of economics is just consumers in general. They just have that name. So there's the households of consumers, and they're the ones that use rent, wages, interest, and profit to purchase products from the product market. And then there's the firms that produce the products, and they basically provide the products for the households to purchase. So essentially that's why this is called a circular flow of income model, because everything's going from one kind of market and type of consumer / producer to the other, and in most cases they'll flow from one to the other, and that's why it's a circular flow. However, there are things called leakages and injections. So basically things can be leaked out of an economy. So these can take the form of, hold on, let me just scroll down. So as you can see here, adding leakages and injections. So leakages can take the form of saving, taxes, and imports. And then they can also take the form, and then injections, which are things that can be injected back into an economy, can be investment, government spending, and exports. And hopefully we're all familiar with the ADAS model, which is a graph with a demand and a supply curve. So this is the aggregate demand curve, which is the total amount of goods and services that individuals and households within an economy are willing and able to buy at any given price level. So this axis can be labeled price level, while this axis can be labeled real wages or output or real output. This is the aggregate demand curve, this is the aggregate supply curve, and where they intersect is the equilibrium point. So this is the output 0, and this is price level 0. So essentially, if this is the economy for the United States of America, basically what this graph is telling is that for all the suppliers of the economy and all the demanders, basically us consumers in an economy, they will be producing at this price level and providing this quantity. So, yeah, so that's essentially what the ADAS model is providing for us. Um, and then, so that's basically the circular flow model. Now we can go into measures of economic activity. So there's three kind of approaches that that macroeconomists use to measure economic activity. Some are more popular than others, some aren't, but there's three. One's called the expenditure approach. And then this one basically says, this one measures GDP. They all measure GDP, but this one basically measures GDP by giving a number providing how much people have spent to buy the final goods and services produced within a country over a given time period. So that has to do with how much money people spend. Then there's the income approach. That's a little bit different, and it's not as popular because it has some flaws to it. The income approach basically adds up like all the income earned by the factors of production within an economy. So it's not basically the expenditure approach where that one is telling you how much people spend to buy final goods and services. Rather, the income approach is basically just measuring income and using that to base off economic activity. And then the output approach is very similar to the expenditure approach, but it's just calculating like the value of all the goods and services. So not how much people actually spend, but how much each product is like worth in the product market. So yeah, those are the three types of measuring economic activity. All three are used by economists, but I would definitely say that expenditure approach is definitely the most widely used, just because it's quite easy. Because there are flaws. Of course, there's the underground economy that we all know about, the black market where people sell goods and services and it never gets recorded in a formal transaction. So there's a flaw there because no measure of GDP will ever be 100% accurate, but the expenditure approach gets it pretty spot on. So and then the income approach is kind of hard to like determine like the income earned by the factors of production sometimes. Like it's just a less expedited way of measuring economic activity, so we try not to use that. And then the output approach is also a valid way of measuring economic activity, but it is important to know these three. I think it adds kind of different depth to your knowledge of economic activity, and it's good to be able to calculate all three because then you can compare and contrast and kind of realize where the benefits and flaws lie for each one. 1 minute break. I just need to get my laptop charged. Okay. Hold on. Okay. So, and then we can go into basically the components of the aggregate demand curve. So, assuming you've never heard of the aggregate demand curve, so that graph that we just looked at is basically the most simple macroeconomic graph that we can analyze. So basically this is the ADAS model. One component of it is the aggregate demand curve. So the definition of aggregate demand is the total amount of goods and services all consumers within an economy are, one, able, and two, willing to purchase in a given time period, of course. So let's say that we have an example economy. Let's call this country A. And of course, this would never occur, but let's just, for simplicity purposes, say that country A produces soda and candy. Very healthy economy. So if we were to draw the aggregate demand curve for this economy, this curve is demonstrating at each price level. So let's say that this is $2, $4, $6, $8. And this would mean this is the total amount of candy and soda, like value combinations there are, because it's aggregate, not on a individual level. So let's say that basically, if this is price level and this is real GDP, so basically what this aggregate demand curve is saying is that at a price level of $8, the consumers are willing and able to buy less, because this is also output of candy and soda combined, because it is a higher price. So naturally, when something's a higher price, people demand less of it. But at $6, consumers will begin to demand a little bit more because they're able to afford it, more are willing and able to purchase it. Now at the lowest price level, $2, that's when you really see that consumers are, in country A, consumers are willing and able to buy more. So that's why the demand curve is downward sloping, because as price level decreases, consumers are willing and able to buy more of a certain product or every product within an economy. And that's just due to people's tendencies. People tend to buy more products when they're cheaper, as we all do. So that's the AD model, and we can call this the aggregate demand curve. And there are certain things that get included in the aggregate demand curve that are important to know. So as we can see, there are 4, and it's important to drill this into your head, like kind of memorize it. I call it C plus G plus I plus X minus M. And each of these components, each of these 4 components, all get included in this aggregate demand curve, the value of it. So first we have C. C is consumption spending. So consumption spending is basically all the money that consumers spend within an economy to buy every good within an economy, and that's one component of AD. The next is G, which is government spending. Government spending is also another component of aggregate demand, and that includes what the government uses to spend its money on. So that can be anything like military spending, health education spending, literally anything the government decides to allocate its resources to is also included within the aggregate demand curve. And then we have I, which is investment spending. And investment spending is anything a business spends money on to improve the quality of its products in the future. Or, I mean, to give an example, if a pizza company decides to buy a second location, like a second building, that can be included under investment spending because it's going to be used towards the production of new goods in the future. Same with if the pizza company were to buy a new stove, that's investment spending. I think a lot of people, when they think of investment, they think of like stock market, bond market, things like that, but that's not entirely. In fact, that's actually a very small portion of what investment spending within the economy is. It's mostly just comprised of capital goods, which are goods that are used to make other goods in the future. So yeah, and then also we have X minus M, which is net exports or imports, depending on which are larger, but and then this is also what are included in the aggregate demand curve. So in case you don't know, exports are the goods and services that an economy produces within its borders and then sells them to other nations and ships them out. And imports are what we buy from other countries and get imported to our nation. So yeah, that's the four components of the aggregate demand curve. And that's only one component of the ADAS model, but we'll go into the supply curve soon. And then I guess just to finish up, we can go over the differences between GDP and GNI. So GDP and GNI are kind of similar. They measure sort of the same things, but not quite. So GDP is exactly the same as the definition of the AD curve, because the AD curve basically is just measuring GDP at different price levels. So it's still the final value of goods and services produced within a nation's borders over a given time period. That's very important because if no time period is given, then it's hard to determine or analyze anything about it. Yes, over a given time period. So that's GDP. GNI is a little bit different, and essentially what it measures is it's kind of funky. It's the total income that is earned or received by citizens within one nation. So the way they measure this is basically it doesn't have to be produced within the borders of the nation, but if there's a certain citizen, let's give an example. Let's say that there is a resident of the United States, but he's working in Germany right now. If he sends back money from Germany, but he's a resident of the United States, and then he sends it back to the United States or something, or he just earns it, but he's still a resident of the United States and he lives here, then that's counted in the GNI. But that would not be counted in GDP. That's the difference between the two, because GDP is only measuring the final value of goods and services produced within a nation's borders at any given time, but GNI can also include stuff that's not produced within our borders, but still by residents of this country. So those are the differences between GDP and GNI. Both are used by economists to measure certain economic indicators to measure growth, of course, but they both have their flaws, for sure. While GDP could be a good indicator for one country, it might not be as strong as a teller for economic growth for another country. It really just all depends. And there's always benefits and disadvantages for all of them. One second. Yeah. So that was a little introduction to macro. And then if anyone's watching this right now, definitely leave a comment below and let me know um, maybe some topics in macro that you'd want to go over. Next video, literally anything in macro I can do or I can help you with because I've had a good teacher, so I was able to learn about a lot about it. So if you have any questions or literally anything you want to know, just comment down below and I will definitely be willing to help. I just started at the basics of the basics just to get this off the ground rolling, and I hope you guys have a great day. I'm not really quite sure